The Royal Vault is a burial chamber about 16 feet below St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. It was built starting in 1804 by orders of King George III and currently serves as the final resting place for 24 royal family members, including 4 kings.
Palace insiders are panicking. When they cracked open the Royal Vault at Windsor Castle, workers made a discovery so shocking that 3 of them quit on the spot. The Queen never wanted you to see this. What was lurking inside those coffins? Why are officials desperately trying to cover this up? Deep within the walls of Windsor Castle lies one of the most significant royal burial sites in British history. St. George's Chapel has served as the final resting place for numerous monarchs and members of the royal family for centuries. As Westminster Abbey gradually filled with the tombs of medieval kings and queens, there was a growing need for an alternative royal burial location. St. George's Chapel became that place, and over the years, it has housed the remains of some of England's most notable rulers. The chapel itself holds a unique status in the Church of England. It is classified as a royal peculiarity, meaning it falls under the direct jurisdiction of the monarchy, rather than a diocese or parish. This special designation has made it an ideal location for royal burials and ceremonies throughout the centuries. Within the choir of the chapel, visitors can find the burial vault of King Henry VIII, the infamous Tudor monarch known for his 6 marriages. He rests alongside his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, who died shortly after giving birth to his only legitimate son. Nearby lies the executed King Charles I, whose body was interred quietly to avoid civil unrest following the English Civil War. The chapel also contains the remains of Henry VI, a king murdered during the Wars of the Roses, and his longtime rival Edward IV. Most recently, Queen Elizabeth II, Britain's longest-reigning monarch, was laid to rest here after her death in 2022. Over the centuries, various burial vaults and coffins within St. George's Chapel have been opened and disturbed for different reasons. Some were opened during restoration work, others to accommodate new burials, and some out of historical curiosity. Understanding what happened when these royal coffins were opened provides fascinating insights into both burial practices and the lives of these historical figures. The royal vault that exists beneath St. George's Chapel today is considered nearly full, containing the coffins of dozens of royals and minor members of the royal family. The chapel's history as a religious building dates back centuries. A chapel was originally built within Windsor Castle's walls and dedicated to George the Martyr, eventually becoming known as St. George's Chapel. During the Wars of the Roses and the early Tudor period, the building underwent extensive redevelopment. However, the English Civil War brought destruction to the chapel, with parliamentarian forces pillaging and plundering the interior. After the execution of King Charles I, his body was buried in a specially constructed vault alongside Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Further changes and restorations were carried out during the reigns of the Georgian monarchs and Queen Victoria. Edward IV was one of the first monarchs to be buried inside St. George's Chapel. His will specified that he was to be placed in a vault with a chapel built over it, complete with space for an altar and a tomb featuring his figure in silver and gilt, or at least copper and gilt. The will also provided for a chantry of 2 priests and accommodation for 13 poor beadsmen to live within the college. The king's remains lay undisturbed for several centuries until repair work was ordered by King George III. When workers discovered Edward IV's burial vault, they found it was quite small, measuring only 9 feet long and under 4 feet wide, with several arches built into its structure. Inside, they found the remains of a wooden coffin containing the skull and bones of Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's wife, which had been placed on top of a lead coffin. When Edward's coffin was opened, his complete skeleton was discovered, still with shoulder-length brown hair attached to his skull. One witness claimed that when the coffin was first opened, the body maintained its natural form, but quickly crumbled to powder once exposed to air. This discovery revealed that there were actually numerous individual burial vaults for different royals throughout the chapel. However, King George III ordered the excavation and construction of a proper communal royal vault underneath the chapel floor. This became known as the Tomb House. Inside this vault, there are several shelves held behind iron bars. Currently, 25 bodies of royal family members are buried in coffins stored in this section of the vault. The bodies are literally placed onto shelves and left in this manner, a rather stark and utilitarian approach to royal burial. Princess Amelia, daughter of George III and his wife Charlotte, was the first person interred in the royal vault in 1810. Princess Charlotte followed in 1817 after dying in childbirth. The tomb house now holds the remains of numerous royals, including King George III, George IV, William IV, and many of their children, grandchildren, and other family members. Near the shelves, there are several central plinths where the coffins of certain kings and queens were placed to highlight their importance. Some historical images of the royal vault even show coffins adorned with crowns. Throughout the centuries, there have been rearrangements and changes to the royal vault, with different monarchs stipulating how the coffins should be organized. Some had coffins placed on the side racking, while others positioned closer relatives on the central plinth. Access to the royal vault is controlled and limited. There is a staircase for those with proper clearance, such as priests who regularly visit to pray. However, the primary entry point is through a lift mechanism in the central part of the chapel. This is essentially a hole in the floor that moves up and down, transporting coffins into the vault below. Coffins are lowered to a chamber that connects to the main royal vault. During Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, her body was symbolically lowered into the royal vault using this electronic lift. Her exceptionally heavy coffin, made of English oak and lined with lead, was then brought back out of the vault several hours after the funeral because she was destined to be buried in a small chantry chapel alongside her father, King George VI, and her mother. Prince Philip, her husband and consort, had his coffin stored inside the royal vault for roughly a year. This arrangement was likely made because planners knew the Queen did not have long to live, or perhaps the intention was always to keep Philip's body in the vault until he could be buried alongside his wife. By waiting, there would only be one interment ceremony in the memorial chapel, rather than two separate events. The standard process for burials in the royal vault followed a specific pattern. The funeral service would take place inside St. George's Chapel, followed by the committal. During the committal, the coffin would be lowered into the royal vault, using the lift fitted near the altar. The coffin would then either be placed on the central area of the vault or stored on the shelving behind the iron railings. The vault itself is believed to be quite cool, though it is not refrigerated. This natural coolness helps preserve the remains in relatively good condition. Queen Elizabeth II was the longest reigning monarch in British history. She had very specific plans outlined for her burial, and the location of her interment was prepared during her lifetime with her consultation. Many people assume that Elizabeth is buried in the royal vault, but this is not accurate. She was laid to rest in a small memorial chapel built during her reign at her request. The King George VI Memorial Chapel inside St. George's Chapel was commissioned by Elizabeth in 1962. It was intended as the burial place for her father, George VI, and her mother. The work required for the chapel was significant. The architects designed the small chapel to contain the remains of 3 monarchs and their consorts. In December 1962, Elizabeth's private secretary wrote to the Dean of Windsor with 2 requests. First, that Prince Charles, her eldest son, should be prepared for confirmation. Second, that a specific resting place needed to be found for her father, George VI. Following George's funeral, his remains had been lowered into the royal vault and stored there because his sudden death meant there was no pre-made tomb or designated space for his body. Elizabeth wanted a specific area inside St. George's Chapel, dedicated to her family. The request was not acted upon for 5 years because the Queen wanted to spare her mother the ordeal of burying her husband a second time. Elizabeth also disliked the life-size effigies on tombs found throughout Westminster Abbey and St. George's Chapel for past monarchs. Space was already extremely limited inside the chapel, so it was decided that a chantry chapel would be built extending from the exterior of St. George's Chapel, with the entrance leading off the nave. This was the first addition to the chapel since the early 16th century. Several plans were drawn up for the burial chapel, and many were rejected. The second plan, proposed by architect George Pace, was eventually approved. This design involved creating the chantry chapel between the Rutland Chapel and the north choir of St. George's Chapel. The design was modest in size, measuring 18 feet high, 10 feet wide, and 14 feet deep. The work was completed in 1969. The chapel sits between two external buttresses of the north wall of the choir and is constructed from stone quarried in Clipsham in Rutland. Stained glass in red and blue was created for the small chapel, and the roof is decorated with embedded gold leaf. The chapel also contains an altar with a portrait of King George VI. The completed chapel was designed to continue and complement the architectural features of St. George's Chapel. Beneath the chapel floor is an interment chamber, and the floor can be lifted to bury monarchs in different graves. However, even though the chapel is relatively modern, it is already becoming quite full. When viewing the small chapel in person, what strikes visitors most is just how tiny the room actually is. Based on the measurements, it might not sound particularly small, but standing inside, the space is remarkably compact and intimate. King George VI's remains were transferred to the newly completed chapel on March 24, 1969. The project cost over £500,000 in today's currency and was entirely funded by the royal family. The chapel was dedicated in a ceremony attended by much of the royal family, including the Queen Mother and many members of the Order of the Garter. The chapel contains gates inscribed with meaningful words taken from King George VI's 1939 Christmas message to the nation, delivered as the Second World War gripped Europe. The message provided hope and security to the British people during an uncertain time. Also interred inside the chapel are the ashes of Princess Margaret, the Countess of Snowdon, who was the younger sister of Elizabeth II. Margaret died after battling a smoking-related illness. Unlike most members of the royal family, Margaret was cremated. Following a private service at St. George's Chapel, her remains were taken to Slough Crematorium. Margaret had reportedly found the royal burial ground at Frogmore rather gloomy and wanted to be buried alongside her father. Her ashes were temporarily placed in the royal vault before being moved to the King George VI Memorial Chapel following her mother's funeral. The Queen Mother died 7 weeks after Margaret, and the plan had always been to bury her in this chapel alongside her husband. Margaret's ashes were retrieved from the royal vault and placed inside her parents' tomb at the same time the Queen Mother's coffin was buried. This means that beneath George VI's ledger stone lie not just the king and his wife, but also his daughter, Princess Margaret. A separate stone marker for Margaret is placed in the right-hand corner of the chapel, with an epitaph she wrote herself. The next member of the royal family to be buried in this chapel was Prince Philip, Elizabeth's husband, who died in 2021 at an advanced age. What is less well known is that following Philip's death and funeral, his body was lowered into the royal vault, and his coffin remained there for some time. This was likely due to insider knowledge that Elizabeth did not have long left to live. Elizabeth and her husband died roughly a year apart, and Philip's body was kept in the royal vault, in preparation for being interred when Elizabeth died. When Elizabeth's body was taken into St. George's Chapel, the funeral service took place, and her coffin was then lowered into the royal vault as part of the committal. However, this was largely symbolic. After the public funeral concluded, in a private service on the evening of September 19, 2022, at approximately 7:30, Elizabeth was laid to rest inside the memorial chapel she herself had commissioned. The remains of Prince Philip were also moved into the chapel after the Queen's interment. Interestingly, her coffin had been constructed over 30 years before her funeral. It was made of English oak and lead lined to prevent decay. 9 pallbearers were needed to lower her remains into the vault due to the substantial weight of the wooden and lead coffin. The death of Elizabeth shocked the world, particularly because many people had only ever known one British monarch during their entire lives. What many do not realize is that she is not technically buried inside the royal vault itself, but rather in the separate memorial chapel she created for her family. Following his death, King Henry VIII would be buried in a relatively modest vault, which stands in stark contrast to his larger-than-life reputation and the grand legacy he left behind. He remains in this burial vault today, despite his wishes being quite different. The vault containing Henry has been broken into several times over the centuries, and each time, the most infamous king of England was disturbed. On January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died. His death was reportedly peaceful, and he was attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. In his final moments, the king acknowledged that he had sinned greatly throughout his life. Following his death, the king's body was washed inside his chambers, though his demise was kept secret for several days before being announced to Parliament. With this announcement, Edward VI was proclaimed king. Henry's heart and vital organs were removed, and it is believed these were placed in lead caskets and buried separately from his body. The king's body was then placed into a coffin and laid in state in the presence chamber of Whitehall Palace, surrounded by burning candles. From there, it was moved in an enormous procession to Windsor Castle and St. George's Chapel. Henry had stated in his will that he wanted to be buried with his third wife, Jane Seymour, who had died following childbirth at Hampton Court. Jane's death was tragic, as she never recovered from complications after delivering the male heir Henry so desperately wanted. Had Jane survived, it is unlikely Henry would have married again, but her death changed the course of history. Jane's body, minus her heart, which had been buried in Hampton Court's chapel, was taken to St. George's Chapel and buried in a vault under the choir floor, demonstrating her importance to the king. Henry initially planned to be placed in this vault temporarily before being moved to a much larger and grander tomb inside Westminster Abbey, positioned near his father and mother's resting place. The tomb Henry envisioned had been planned for decades before his death. He wanted it to be larger and more magnificent than the tomb of his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Italian sculptors were contracted to work on the project, and Henry argued with them extensively over the design details. However, the king died before the tomb was finished, and his children chose not to invest the enormous sum of money required to complete it, meaning Henry's dreams of being buried in a grand memorial would never come to fruition. After Henry's death and embalming, his coffin was taken on an immense procession from Whitehall Palace to Windsor Castle. The procession stretched 4 miles long, and roads had to be widened to allow it to pass. The hearse carrying the king's coffin was pulled by horses draped in black cloth. On top of the coffin sat a wax effigy of Henry, covered in jewels and dressed in his clothes. For many people who witnessed the procession, this was their first time seeing an image of their king. The crown was also placed atop the coffin. The funeral procession stopped at Seymour Abbey for the evening to rest. There have been rumors throughout the centuries that while the coffin rested there, the king's body exploded and parts of Henry dripped out of the coffin. This may have been caused by gases building up inside the body after death, a phenomenon that is known to occur. The coffin of Henry VIII reached Windsor and was carried into the church by 16 yeomen of the guard. Such was the weight of the Tudor king's coffin. The funeral service then took place, and his coffin was lowered into the vault, where it still remains 5 centuries later. His officers of the household broke their staves of office and threw them into the vault after the coffin, symbolizing the end of his reign. Today, there is no pomp or ceremony regarding the king's burial site. It is marked by a simple marble slab that reads, "In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII, 1537, King Henry VIII, 1547, King Charles I, 1648, and an infant child of Queen Anne." Henry was disturbed several times, mostly to accommodate the burial of others in his vault. Most significantly, he would be buried next to someone he would have considered his greatest enemy. King Charles I was placed next to Henry's coffin. Charles was a Stuart, and Henry VIII during his reign had effectively barred the Stuarts from ever becoming the kings of England. However, after his daughter Elizabeth I died without children or heirs, the Stuarts became the rulers of England anyway. Charles I is remembered in history as one of the most controversial kings who threw his country into civil war. Charles was placed on trial after his defeat and was condemned to death before being beheaded by an executioner at Whitehall. Because of the fear surrounding Charles and the hostility toward his execution, Parliament tried to ensure that Charles was buried quietly. They were particularly worried that royalists would dig him up and venerate him as a martyr. For this reason, Charles was quietly buried in Henry VIII's vault. The vault was actually quite cramped, with just Henry and his wife Jane inside. When workers needed to fit Charles's coffin in, they had to move Henry's coffin to the side, and it is believed they may have damaged it in the process. Another Stuart would also be added to this vault, one child born to Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch. The infant was buried at the feet of Henry VIII in a small coffin. In 1813, the vault would be broken into yet again as building work was being carried out inside St. George's Chapel. The builders entered the vault containing Henry VIII's remains, and then officials opened the coffin of King Charles I to see what was inside. The Prince Regent, the future George IV, oversaw this examination. They noticed that Henry's coffin was in poor condition and had been broken. The trestle it had been sitting on was broken and had collapsed, likely when Charles's coffin was squeezed in. The pressure from within Henry's body was also said to have splintered the wood, and the top of the coffin had allegedly split open. There is no record of any work being done to move Henry into a more suitable coffin, meaning his body may still be exposed to the air today. Henry VIII was one of the most notorious and controversial kings ever to rule England. Yet he is buried in a modest place where he never wanted to remain.